Merci, merci, Andre. Yeah, so we were actually listening to the Red River Echoes album by Andy Desjarlais. This was actually the album that inspired the name of our collective, this very one. So yeah, that's what we were listening to. But yeah, thank you, Andre, for the introduction. I'll just start by saying a little bit about who I am before I get into the nitty-gritty of the MMF and Métis governance generally. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge too, as Andre said, all of the wisdom in the room. I believe as, the people who own ourselves, that we all hold inherent wisdom and understanding about what Métis governance means. And so this is just where I'm at in that journey, and I'm open to hearing where everyone else is at in that journey as well. Yeah, we're all just kind of figuring this out together. But so my family, my Métis family is from St. Ambrose, Manitoba. My Pepe was Steve Lavallee, who was a Métis man, and he was really instrumental in the founding of Seven Oaks Local, which is a current local in the Winnipeg region of the MMF. And so I actually grew up with my Pepe and my aunties being executives of the local. So I had folks coming to my house while I was growing up to get their Métis card signed by my mom. Yeah, so the MMF has been a big part of my life since the beginning. My mère, her family is from St. Adolphe, and she's actually, her maiden name is Delorme, so she's a descendant of Pierre Delorme, who is actually a founding member of the Union Nationale as well. So lots of Métis governance history in my family that I'm happy to continue that work on, just as we all are here. And yeah, I also, I guess for context with the MMF, because my family was involved with the MMF from the beginning of my life, it's always kind of just been part of what it meant to be Métis, was thinking about how to be involved with the MMF. And, I saw my aunties put so much work in, and I think that's the same story for so many people who have been involved with locals, is seeing so many Métis people in the grassroots level doing so much of that good work that's done by the MMF. And so in addition to my family's experiences, I also worked at the MMF for a few years after high school, and I worked at the Winnipeg region. It was the Winnipeg Métis Association at that time at McGregor, that office. And during that time, I was able to work with citizenships. And so I was intaking membership applications and harvester applications. So also, saw the back end of that process, and I know the MMF application process is pretty mystical to everyone. And so having been on the back end of it, I understand the confusion, because it's not easy. Yeah, and so that's my sort of personal experience with the MMF. And then in addition to those lived experiences, I completed a Bachelor of Arts in Human Rights at the University of Winnipeg, where I focused a lot on ideas of international law. And so when I went to law school at McGill, that's what I thought I was going to be doing when I went there. But instead, when I started in 2016, the program at McGill had actually been changed to comply with the TRC recommendations for law schools to integrate Indigenous legal orders. So I was really lucky that I started law school at a time when, Indigenous legal orders were taken seriously on at the same level as Canadian common law and Quebec civil law. So I was really lucky to be in an academic environment where those thoughts were possible. And so those are also things that I'm bringing into here. Is I was really lucky to learn from Indigenous legal scholars about what Indigenous law means. And I also had the chance to look at the MMF's constitution quite closely at various points. So this is something that I've been thinking about a lot for I guess the past 4 years or so. The MMF has occupied a lot of my thoughts and its governance structure. So I'm really happy to go on this journey with you all this evening. So I'm going to share my screen here and we'll get started. Okay, here we go. All right, so welcome everyone. Métis Governance 101. So we're just going to start talking a little bit about what governance means. I think it's important to think about theory before we're talking about, some of the more concrete stuff about law, and specifically when it's, our own, nation that's at stake. I think it's important to really think about what the purpose of the MMF is, and, taking that seriously as a nation, and a nation that is sovereign. So this is just an outline some of the ideas going into what a constitution is and what governance is generally. So governance is a process in which we make decisions on how to create, amend, and enforce a particular worldview or legal order. And so the Greek, I also really like the etymology of words. Maria Campbell once said that words have bundles. And so I always like going to see what the beginning of the word is, what the beginning of that word's bundle was. So the Greek etymology of govern is to steer. So it's really just very simply deciding on the direction. And so how we make decisions is informed by our worldview or our legal orders. And so one important distinction here is that there are differences between Indigenous worldviews and Western worldviews, particularly when it comes to how we express and understand and live our legal systems. So basically, this is really abstract law sort of knowledge, but it's important for understanding the difference between Indigenous legal orders and colonial systems of law. And I think the biggest difference, I'll use Aaron Mills. He's a Anishinaabe legal scholar who we'll see a quote from later as well, but he describes Indigenous worldviews as rooted. And so looking at the word Indigenous, which means from the land, it means that our worldviews are just rooted in the land. And that's different than Western worldviews, which tend to be rooted in abstract values. So for example, the Canadian Constitution, its value is peace, order, and good government. That's the outline of the Canadian Constitution Act of 1867. And so, that's not rooted in land at all. So those are important differences. And so another note, so Canadian colonialism has disrupted but not extinguished Indigenous governance. And so that includes Métis governance. So at the Battle of Batoche, the Métis Nation, we never lost our sovereignty. It just, went sleeping, as, most of us, recognize that period as a dark time in our history, but Métis governance never disappeared. Union Nationale is actually a really good example of how Métis governance survived and existed in forms that were distinctive and not just what we see today. And actually interesting, Andre could maybe speak more about this later, but the original constitution of Union is based off of like local models as well. And so that's what the MMF also uses. So the ways that we've organized, aren't maybe so different. But anyway, so the governance of the Métis Nation is unique within Canada's federal system. And so this is important because in comparison to the other Indigenous groups that are recognized in Canada, the Métis Nation has had a different history, and had different experiences with colonization. So these are sort of two distinct differences. So the first is that we were not considered Indians pursuant to the Constitution Act of 1867. And so what that effectively meant was that from 1867 until 1982, the Métis Nation didn't exist as an Aboriginal people according to Canada's laws. So that was a really big gap for Métis people in terms of like our recognition as a people within Canada, all from a colonial lens, and then the other aspect of this was that because we were not Indians pursuant to the Constitution Act of 1867, we have not been subject to the Indian Act and related band council style governments. So this is important for understanding how we got to the MMF, because Métis people have never been governed by the Indian Act. Our governance systems haven't been controlled in the way that our First Nations can have experienced. And so for better or worse, this has given the Métis a lot of freedom in terms of how we choose to govern ourselves. And so the fact that we have a corporate model now as our governance system isn't inevitable. It is a product, though, of colonialism. All right, so this is a quote from Aaron Mills. And this, I think, is just a really interesting way to think about law, and especially when we're thinking about constitutions in the next slide here. So no two trees are the same, even if they're both white birch, the same age and growing right next to one another. Similarly, while two Anishinaabe communities may have nearly identical constitutional structures, they will have laws that differ. I want to say that every people is a tree. We tell different stories of creation. So Canada's story of creation is, peace, order, good government. Métis stories of creation are, still, I think, being written. So even those of us who don't acknowledge doing so, or who so explicitly disclaim a view of creation, so even if we're not aware of it, we have creation stories. And the story we tell powerfully conditions the constitutional order we bring into being. For all societies, that constitutional order will shape legal processes and institutions, and thus ultimately what we count as law. So I think that this is just really important to just think about, that we can have the same values, same constitutional values, but things can look different. So thinking about what two different trees, two different Métis trees, both Métis trees, but might have little differences. And so I think that those are important to recognize as well. And to know that, nothing is static, everything is changing all the time, that we constantly, decide who we are as a people. It's not something that is fixed. So a constitution establishes our particular worldview or legal order. So constitutions exist in a variety of forms. So for the most part, I think the most common understanding of a constitution in law is the founding document of a country. So those usually will have different outlines about who gets power, who decides, who makes decisions about different areas of governance. So for example, like the fact that the Canadian Constitution makes Indians and land reserved for Indians the jurisdiction of the federal government. That's just a function of a constitution. And so another example of, what could be considered a constitution is the UN Charter. But articles of incorporation for for-profit and nonprofit entities can also be considered constitutions, because as a corporation, you sort of create your own legal order. And so like you talk about like workplace culture and different things like that. And those are actually like a reflection of the law, the constitution, and how power is distributed within an organization. And so how things are organized from a governance level is really important. And so then here, another example of constitutions are rooted constitutions. And so what I've learned from Anishinaabe legal scholars has been that creation stories hold the site, like are basically a constitution. And so the Anishinaabe creation story of Muskrat bringing up the earth from the water and sacrificing their life, that is a creation story, and that's a constitutional order that can inform just as equally as, Canada's Constitution Act of 1867 and 1982, and that those are equally valid as legal orders. All right, and so constitutions are quite simply the stories that we choose to tell about ourselves. So I think we'll just keep that in mind as we go into now into the nitty gritty of the MMF's constitution. And so this is an example of an alternative constitution. This is the Red River Echoes governance model. So here we have the collective. And we have captains and co-captains, and that's inherited from the buffalo hunt language. And so those are rotational positions that change. And here you'll see it's a centralized but non-hierarchical form of government. And so here we have the collective and all of these different governance circles. And so this is just one example, just to give you a visual of what governance can look like. Okay, so this is the Manitoba Métis Federation Inc. Constitution. So it was incorporated in Manitoba in 1967, and as such, it is governed by the Manitoba Business Corporations Act. And so corporations have actually existed for a long time. They're not new since, almost the birth of our nation. Corporations have also existed, but it wasn't corporate governance rules that were being used during the buffalo hunts. That's not what was being used during the 1870 or 1885 resistance. So why now? Why the choice for corporate governance? Especially considering that Métis governance has historically favored decentralized modes of leadership. So that means not vesting power into one single body that is responsible for making decisions, but instead there's wider input, and also an important aspect, particularly when we're talking about a president who has been in place for 27 years. But that we had time-constricted leadership. Leaders were never permanent. You know, Cuthbert Grant's story is a really great example. You know, as soon as it, you know, he wasn't needed as leader, that was no longer his role. And we need to, I think, acknowledge that as Métis people, that we've always sort of practiced a leadership that favors our own freedom. You know, we're the people who own ourselves, as I said earlier. And I think, yeah, I think that's something that, you know, we can really own. And I think we should really be proud of, and that we, you know, deserve a governance model that reflects that. But so I guess the big question here is why is the MMF a corporation? Why is that the way it is? So I know that the MMF has different language about it, but this is what it is this. The MMF later incorporated as a requirement imposed on us by Canada to apply for programming. So this is from the MMF website that I pulled. And then this is actually what's going to be, it's a proposed amendment to the constitutional language. I think it's resolution 2 that's proposed for this upcoming AGA. So this resolution would put this framing, this language into the MMF constitution. So here it says, Canada required the MMF to incorporate MMF Inc. in order to facilitate funding arrangements and the establishment of intergovernmental relationships. So essentially the MMF is saying that Canada made them incorporate to be able to get money. I have lots of different thoughts about that. I'm sure you all have lots of different thoughts about that. I don't understand how you can call yourself a sovereign nation and then still have Canada required in our constitution. That doesn't feel very sovereign to me. But yeah, so that's what it comes down to. And then here it says the MMF has recognized self-government for the Manitoba Métis. So yeah, this Manitoba self-government recognition and implementation agreement that was signed last year. I have a few different thoughts about it. It's not super relevant, I don't think, for this specifically here, but I think it's important to think about language and how it's being used here to change the appearance of the Constitution without actually making structural changes to how it functions. And so here I'm going to go and show you this lovely little graph that was made about the MMF's leadership structure. So, you know, how we showed you the Red River Echoes Constitution, which is a flower, non-hierarchical. Here we have a very clear pyramid with the MMF president at the top. And so here we have, I'll just go do an overview of like how the MMF is structured. So here down here is the MMF members. And so this is all of us. We're all at the bottom of the food chain. I'm assuming, I don't know who is on the call, but for the most part, we're probably all down here. And then there's also the locals. And so then this is here where our next point of contact is. And so the locals, so if you wanted to get your citizenship card, you would go to a local, this is your first point of contact with the MMF. Yeah, so that's where you would go. And then you have the regions. And so it's really actually quite easy to think about the structure if you think about the locals as a municipal government, the regions as a provincial government, and then the executive here as the federal government, just sort of thinking about it in that way. And so here the locals will respond to the regions. And so, for example, the Winnipeg region has, I don't even know how many locals, but that region falls within one of the 7 regions as defined by the MMF. And then so this is the next level. So here, like this would be, okay, this is me, this is the Seven Oaks local, this is the Winnipeg region, and then the next highest level is the Board of Directors Cabinet. So who makes up the Board of Directors? That is the vice president of each region. So there is a VP for each region. The VP of the Winnipeg region is Andrew Carrier. And so he will sit on the Board of Directors. And then there's also 2 regional executives from each region. And so I'm not sure, I think it's usually just 2 of the board members from the region. I don't know if there's requirements about specifically which role, but 2 reps from each region. So effectively you'll have 3 people from each region at the Board of Directors. And then you also have a spokeswoman from the Infinity Women's Secretariat, and that is a new addition that hasn't been there for a long time. I think that was like the early 2000s that came in. I could be wrong about that. But regardless, there's that one spot for women's representation. So this is who makes up the board of directors, and then the head of the board of directors, the chair, is the MMF president. So if any of us down here, any of us MMF members wanted to make it to up here to the region or the vice president, to be the vice president or to just be part of the executive, we must live in the region upon election. And so it's a quick, easy one. But then to run for the board, oh, I'm gonna have to ask about this. We'll just ignore this bubble. So to run for president, so here you are on this point, to run for president, you have to be active for 3 years on a local and 3 years as vice president. So you have to be 3 years down here and then 3 years here to be eligible to be up here, if that makes sense. And we'll get into how that change happened because this is a new thing. So this is extremely complicated. Most governance structures aren't this complicated. The election periods are very confusing in the MMF Constitution. We'll see that in a second here with the way that the language was changed. But so basically, two big questions here is when you have this much power concentrated at the top, there's very little, ability for us down here to have any influence up here. So just for some examples that I was kind of shocked out when looking through the MMF's constitution, they're actually only required per their constitution to meet at least once every calendar year. Usually boards are required to meet around 12 times a year, like 10 to 12 is usually the ballpark. And so it's very odd to me that there's only a requirement to meet once per year. I don't know if there's any government in the world that exists that it can only meet once per year. And so while the language is at least, it's concerning that there's not more accountability in terms of meetings built into the MMF Constitution. And then here as well, this is in terms of compensation. So, and here we'll see this language change too, right? So here, like, this is part of the changes to the Constitution that are proposed is changing language from director to cabinet member. And these are really just superficial changes. They're not substantive changes at all. It's really just to make it look more like a government and less like a corporation. But yeah, so this provision basically just establishes that every year the board decides how much they get paid, and they decide then in a closed door meeting, and that's, yeah, determine each other's salaries every year. So there's also that. All right. Okay, so the annual General Assemblies, this is what's happening this weekend, why we had the talk to begin with. So annual General Assemblies are a function, a governance function of any incorporated body. They're required when you have members. And so here I just have the outline on the side here. You can see this is just pulled straight from the Constitution. And so the purpose of the AGA is for the board, so cabinet, to inform the members of the Federation's activities. This is where you'll get the finances and you'll get review of financial statements, appointment of the auditor for the next year. These are all just, as required by the Corporations Act in Manitoba. And then the members of the Federation shall appoint a resolutions committee. And so this resolutions committee is the committee that put together the resolutions for the AGA, which can be found online. They are linked in this presentation, so if you haven't had the chance to look at them, I definitely recommend doing it. We will take a look at one in a minute. But yeah, so that's what that is for. And then this last provision here, this is where the MMF members have the most power. So by 60% of the members, you have the power to turn down resolutions. However, that doesn't mean that you can table resolutions at the AGA. It only means that you can vote on the things that are put forward. So at the AGA, you're only able to speak on and to have your voice heard on things that were already established by the resolutions committee. So just for context here, this is a really complicated procedure. So the MMF Constitution prohibits members from making resolutions from the floor of the AGA. And so this is the process that has been established for members to make any amendments to the Constitution. So the first thing that you need to do, so anyone who wants to make a change or propose a change to the MMF Constitution will first have to go to your local and obtain the approval of your local. And then after that, if it's approved by the local, the chair of the local will give it to the regional executive. And then after that, the regional executive will determine within 14 days of the proposed bylaw amendment whether or not they will accept it. And then following that, the board of directors, so the MMF cabinet, will review all proposed amendments received from the committee and may suggest changes as appropriate. And any suggested changes by the board will be communicated to the person. However, the board will ultimately decide whether the proposed bylaw amendment should be brought forward to the next AGA or extraordinary AGA. So essentially you have to go to your local, and then your local has to go to the region, and then your region has to bring it to the board, and then the board can still say no. There's no, really clear. It says here, a written explanation to the board's decision shall be provided, but it doesn't provide any outlines of what that written explanation could be. So it's very possible that the written explanation could be very minimal without having really stringent requirements, about reporting on what those, tracking of what members are submitting. So you hear this, based on how this is set up, you could have members who are individually pushing for change at the local level and it never going anywhere. So structurally, it's actually quite difficult to make any kind of changes as a member within the MMF. And that's, common to corporate, structures. Hierarchies are favored because they're more efficient. And so that's what informs these. Yeah, so these are the processes for members. However, of course, the board does have the authority to create their own resolutions, which they do. So here is resolution 7 from the AGA in 2017. And this is the resolution change that changed the requirements to run for president. So here is the language. This is from the annual report from the 2018 AGA. So this is the minutes of the 2017 AGA. So here, resolution number 7, be it resolved, MMF is democratically elected. So these are all the reasons, all of these whereas clauses. The issues must be dealt with by the elected officials in conducting the affairs of the MMF, and they continue to become increasingly more complex. The successful advancements of the rights of Manitoba Métis citizens require that those individuals elected to the MMF have experience in conducting the affairs of the MMF and a demonstrated commitment to working in the best interest of Métis citizens. So that is where the change here. This is what the Constitution prior to 2017 said. So to run for the position of regional vice president or president, a member must at some time have held office for at least 1 year as one of these roles on a local. So you had to volunteer with a local for 1 year, and then you could run as a candidate for any of the positions within the MMF for elected positions. So this is what it was at that point. And then it was deleted and the following section substituted it. So this is now the current language of the MMF Constitution. And so here you can see, obviously, they really added a lot of language to what was just one little article here into a 4-point thing. So the one that's most interesting to us, nothing else here, it basically just added 3 years for any position other than president, which now requires 6. And so here we go, is the C is here. In order to be able to stand for election for the position of president, a member must, during the previous 20 years, have held office for at least 3 years at a local, or have held office at a regional board member of the Infinity Women's Secretariat, as well as have held office for at least 3 years as a regional board member or regional vice president. So here now it went from 1 year to 3 years and 3 years, so 6 years. And this was moved by Minister Jack Park, seconded by Minister Richard Janae, 4 opposed, 1 abstention, and carried. So that's just where that language changed. It was in 2017. And so obviously that's not, the requirements that are now for president are not what were in place when the current president ran. Okay, and then here's a little bit of a spicy resolution coming up at this AGA. So resolution 23, it's the last resolution. So this is also helpful to see what they look like. So all of these resolutions will just have all of these whereas clauses, which are really just like fancy ways to start and give reasons for something. So here, previously, this is what the MMF Constitution stated. So MMF cabinet member shall be entitled to receive an amount for remuneration, which they establish themselves on an annual basis. Elected officers cannot be employees, which is generally pretty standard. For greater clarity, here we go, they can't be considered employees. So here's just further information on that. However, these clauses are now deleted and have been replaced with this. So it is still the case that they determine their salaries on an annual basis. However, they can now be considered employees, including the president, which obviously opens up new opportunities for remuneration. And then here's this final one that's completely new. The MMF may establish a compensation and benefits package for the president and all other MMF cabinet members to provide, in addition to cabinet member fees or any other form of remuneration, an amount of remuneration to be paid following the person ceasing to be an MMF cabinet minister, whether having failed to be re-elected or deciding not to stand for election. So effectively what this means is that if this passes at the AGA, any MMF cabinet member who just chooses not to run for election again is eligible for a compensation package, which, it's not like Brian Bowman is going to get, he'll get a severance package, but it's not like, that's private news and stuff like that. This is really interesting that, this is being put forward now, especially because we don't actually have a date for the election. So I'm curious about what the intention is behind this one. I guess we'll find out on the weekend. So that's just a way to look at the resolutions. And then I thought this was really interesting. This is what's on the MMF website right now when you go to the AGA website. So this bylaw amendment procedure, remember that we looked at here, if you want to make any changes in the MMF as a regular member, that this is the procedure you have to go through, right? You have to go to the local, and then to the region, and then the board decides. So this is what the MMF had to say about that process. It's a process of time and careful consideration and is regarded with reverence and respect. And I was just like, no one even knows what these processes are. How can they be guarded with reverence or respect? And it's certainly not out of reverence or respect for our people, because if we don't know, then it's a serious problem. So yeah, those are just some of my thoughts in terms of that. I just thought it was interesting that the MMF is framing it as if these governance processes are accessible or instinctive to us as Métis people, yeah. So to get to the, I think what a lot of people are interested in with the MMF elections. So the MMF Constitution actually doesn't really have much information in terms of elections, as most corporate bodies, they just determine like their elections as they so choose, as determined by the articles of incorporation. So these are really all of the rules that we know for the election. We'll know within 60 days that there's a notice out. And other than that, there's no like fixed date. And that's entirely possible. Like the MMF could decide to choose a fixed date for an election so that citizens would know like every 4 years when it's coming. It's a choice not to. And so I think, yeah, just to think of that. So I don't have, I know some folks had questions about the elections, but there's actually not a lot of information that I can give about those yet. I can go into the MMF Constitution here, where it'll show, sorry, I'm just gonna have to reshare. Okay, let's go into here. And I just want to show, mostly just because the elections information is just really like complex and really difficult to get through. And so I didn't want to just like copy paste a whole bunch of screenshots onto the PowerPoint there. So here is the bylaws concerning the elections. So election bylaws. This is the 2019 Constitution, which is the current one. And it'll be amended at this EGA. But here, so here we go. So if you actually want to go read it, this is what it looks like. All of the definitions are here. So there's a chief electoral officer that's determined. Election day is just means the day when they call the election. Yeah, and then here's the outline for the chief electoral officer. So that's just all of the responsibilities that they'll have. Here's the timing of election rule. So it's just the 60 days notice. The chief electoral officer will prepare the list of electors. So that's where all of our names will be put down. And to vote in an MMF election, you have to be a voting member. And so that means your MMF card will say voting. There'll be a V on your number. It'll be like V0 something, something, something. And that V stands for voting. So if you have a child and they have a card, you'll notice that they don't have voting rights. So yeah, there's just that. And then here's just more appointments, nominations. And so then here, these dates of nominations are all going to be subject to whatever the dates are of the election whenever it's called. Qualifications of candidates, and then here's where we get into the details about being able to run for president, and then challenge to candidates. So I don't know if anyone's interested in pursuing this option, but there is an option of challenging candidates, and this outlines the process for that through the chief electoral officer. Yeah, and then here's just, so there's really not a whole lot in the Constitution. Like these are all just, basic rules. So yeah, in terms of elections, I don't have a ton of information. All I know is that if you're a voting member, you can vote. Your card will tell you if you are. And yeah, that's where we're at. And then I guess just to end on the future of Métis governance. I know that it seems like it might be a lot to chip away at, but I take a lot of comfort in the fact that, as a people, we have always done things in unexpected ways, and we've always come together, and so much strength in the diversity of our nation. So many different languages, so many different even like names for what our people are called, everything from the people who own ourselves to flower beadwork people, Michif, all of these different ways that we understand ourselves. I think that there's, room for all of those different understandings of what it means to be Métis in the future. And I hope that one day we have a governance model that reflects that. Yeah, And so, yeah, thanks everyone for listening. I'm excited to hear questions. And we'll send out this PowerPoint, and I'll put together a list of sources and everything for folks if they wanted to access anything. Yeah, thank you.